Hello, friends. Welcome to Soft History Stories, where we'll take you on a mysterious journey to medieval times. Imagine, for a moment, a time when the world was full of strange and bizarre laws that seemed almost impossible to believe. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time of superstition, chaos, and unpredictability, where the rules of society were sometimes shaped by the most ridiculous or outlandish events. It was a time when a simple accident or an outrageous act could result in a law that echoed through generations. Have you ever wondered how something as absurd as a pig being put on trial could lead to an entire legal system evolving? Or how one nobleman's bored decision to dress a goose in armor would lead to a law banning animals from participating in jousts? These aren't just the quirky footnotes of history, they were real events that caused major ripples in medieval society, sparking laws that shaped the lives of kings, peasants, and everyone in between. Imagine it now, a medieval courtroom crowded with serious-looking men in robes, not for a human trial, but for a pig that has been accused of murder. Picture it. This was medieval France in 1386, when a pig wandered into a street, attacked a child, and was formally put on trial, complete with a defense lawyer and an execution by hanging. Ridiculous, right? Yet, this bizarre event resulted in a new law that declared no animal could be tried or executed without ecclesiastical approval. That's how laws were made back then, through wild, chaotic occurrences that often seemed more like fiction than reality. But behind these bizarre laws were deeper implications about power, control, and, often, survival. And it doesn't stop there. The laws that emerged from these strange incidents were not just footnotes in history, they were part of a larger system of order, control, and even superstition. From knights showing up at jousts with armored geese, to bakers who dared to bake a loaf of bread that resembled a royal crown, the rules and customs of the time were shaped by moments of wild unpredictability. But these laws weren't just about keeping people in line. They were about sending a message that reinforced power, control, and sometimes fear. So, why should we care about these seemingly absurd medieval laws? Because, believe it or not, they had a lasting impact. They affected everything from politics to social status, and even survival. They shaped the way people interacted with each other, the way power was distributed, and how society functioned as a whole. These strange, often laughable events left a mark on the medieval world, and in some ways, they still echo through the laws and customs we follow today. As you settle in, imagine the strange, often absurd world of medieval law. Picture a time when a simple misstep, like a bread loaf looking too much like a crown, could lead to an inquisition, or when a drunken joust would inspire a law banning alcohol from tournament. It's a wild ride through history that shows just how strange and unpredictable life could be, even in the halls of power. So get comfortable, and let's dive into a world where the bizarre and the extraordinary shaped the laws that governed an entire era. If you're ready for some strange history, grab your favorite blanket and let's explore the medieval world together. The Pig on Trial, a lesson in medieval justice. In the year 1386, in the small town of Falaise, France, an event occurred that would go down in history, not because of its significance in the grand scheme of political or military affairs, but because of its sheer absurdity and the lasting effects it would have on medieval law. This was a moment when the world of the Middle Ages, already steeped in superstition and strange customs, would see a trial unlike anything seen before an animal trial. A pig, of all creatures, would stand trial for murder. The details surrounding the incident are, by modern standards, strange to the point of absurdity. One morning, in Falaise, a pig unremarkable by any measure, just a regular farm animal, wandered into the streets. As pigs are wont to do, it rooted around in the dirt, looking for food. However, its wandering took a dark turn when it allegedly attacked a child. The child, tragically, lost their life in the attack. This, in itself, is not a unique or unprecedented event. Pigs are known for their erratic behavior and are sometimes dangerous when threatened or hungry. In the modern world, such an incident might be dismissed as just another unfortunate event in farm life. But this was the Middle Ages, where logic and reason were often suspended in favor of superstition and moral order. And so, The townspeople, rather than simply dealing with the pig in the most logical way by either killing it or sending it back to the farm, decided to put it on trial. What followed was a courtroom spectacle unlike anything seen before, and perhaps, in many ways, something that might never be seen again. The pig was chained up and formally charged with murder. Yes, a pig, not a human being, but an animal, was being held accountable for a human death. The townspeople and the local authorities took this matter very seriously. A judge was called. A defense lawyer was appointed, who, if nothing else, must have had one of the most awkward jobs in medieval legal history, and a full trial was conducted. A defense attorney, standing before the court, would have had to make the case that a pig, a creature that, according to the law, had no legal standing and could not be held responsible for its actions, was innocent, perhaps arguing that the animal had acted out of hunger or fear. Of course, the entire situation was nothing short of absurd, but that did not stop the trial from unfolding with all the seriousness of a trial of a human being. The courtroom was filled with the gravity of the situation. The pig, despite being an animal, was treated as though it had the same level of moral agency as a human being. It was assigned an attorney, its case was heard, and witnesses were brought forward to testify. The charge? Murder. The accusation? That the pig had acted with malice and forethought, an argument that, if proven, would make this the first ever case of premeditated murder committed by an animal in history. The defense lawyer, no doubt, found himself in the most bizarre of positions, defending a pig that could neither understand the charges nor mount any defense in its own favor. Still, he would have argued, likely with some measure of embarrassment, that his client had acted on impulse rather than on malice. In the end, the pig was found guilty. It was sentenced to death by hanging, the same punishment that would have been meted out to a human murderer. The event became a spectacle. A crowd gathered to witness the execution, and the pig, dressed in human clothing, an absurdity in itself, was led to the gallows. The public watched, some likely with morbid curiosity, others with horror at what they were witnessing. The pig was hanged, its execution completed in the same manner as that of any human criminal. It was a dark, surreal moment in the town's history, one that would resonate for years to come. The execution, however, was not the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in medieval law. The pig's trial and subsequent execution caused such a stir that it reached the ears of the higher authorities, including the church. The town's bishop, concerned about the precedent this trial set, intervened. The church had always held significant sway in matters of justice and morality during the Middle Ages, and the idea of putting an animal on trial without ecclesiastical approval raised alarm. The church, after all, was the institution that dictated the moral and ethical code of the time. According to the medieval worldview, everything, from humans to animals to inanimate objects, existed within a divinely ordered system. But putting animals on trial was not in line with the teachings of the church, and so the bishop intervened, putting a stop to such practices. A new law was enacted, stating that no animal could be tried or executed without prior ecclesiastical permission. The creation of this new law marked a significant shift in the way medieval societies viewed the relationship between humans and animals. From that moment on, animals could not be tried or executed without first receiving approval from the church. This law was not confined to Falaise alone, it spread throughout Europe, setting a precedent for future trials of animals. It was an absurd yet profound legal development in the context of medieval jurisprudence, and it remained in place for centuries. But the absurdity of the trial did not end with the pig. In the years that followed, the idea of animals standing trial became a trend that spread across Europe. The bizarre logic of medieval justice dictated that animals could be held accountable for their actions, and in the years following the Falaise pig's trial, other animals were tried in courts across Europe. There were reports of roosters being tried for witchcraft, goats accused of immorality, and even cows being fined for trespassing. These trials, while often humorous in hindsight, were taken very seriously at the time and reflected the deep-seated superstitions that governed medieval life. They were part of a larger belief system that viewed the world as a moral ecosystem, where even animals had a role to play. In many ways, these trials were a reflection of the medieval understanding of justice, which was often rooted in superstition, religious belief, and the idea that everything, from the natural world to human behavior, was part of a divine order. The trials of animals were a reminder that, for the people of the Middle Ages, there was no clear line between the human and animal world. Both were subject to the same laws and moral codes. The medieval mindset was one in which the supernatural, the divine, and the mundane were intertwined. And this worldview allowed for the belief that animals could be held accountable for their actions, just as humans were. In the modern world, the idea of an animal standing trial for murder or witchcraft seems utterly ridiculous. Yet, in the context of the Middle Ages, it made a kind of twisted sense. The pig's trial in Falaise was not just an absurdity. It was a reflection of the worldview of the time. It was a world in which animals were seen as part of a larger divine order, and when that order was disrupted, it was the responsibility of human society to restore balance, even if that meant holding a pig accountable for its actions. The legacy of the pig's trial lives on, though it is now a historical curiosity, a symbol of medieval absurdity and the strange logic of the past. It is a reminder of how strange and unpredictable history can be, and how even the most bizarre incidents can shape the laws and traditions that govern society for centuries. The trial of the pig in 1386 serves as a cautionary tale, one about the dangers of taking things too far, of letting superstition and fear guide legal decisions, and of the absurd lengths to which societies will go to impose order on a chaotic world. And while the idea of a pig standing trial for murder may seem laughable now, in its time, it was a serious matter, a reflection of the deep and often illogical logic that governed medieval life. The goose joust, a ridiculous nightly incident. In the Middle Ages, jousting tournaments were more than just a sport. They were a critical expression of knighthood, valor, and the noble ideals that governed society. The grand jousts, epic displays of skill, strength, and chivalric duty, were meant to impress the court, to showcase one's abilities with a lance, and to elevate the prestige of those who participated. These tournaments, with their heavy armor, stirring clamor, and noble participants, epitomized the very essence of what it meant to be a knight. But, as with so many medieval tales, there were moments when the pursuit of glory collided with the absurd, and the results were as chaotic as they were humorous. Such was the case with a bizarre incident in the 14th century, one that would leave an indelible mark on the history of jousting and animal participation in tournaments forever. The tale begins in Bohemia, where the noble class were preparing for a grand jousting tournament, as they often did in times of peace, to show off their prowess and entertain the court. Among the knights was one particularly bored nobleman who had grown tired of the typical joust. The lances, the horses, the riders, everything seemed too predictable, too ordinary. He longed for something new, something that would make his appearance stand out from the rest. And so, in a moment of inspiration or perhaps madness, he decided that he would not only participate in the joust, but he would introduce something entirely unexpected into the arena: a fully armored goose. Yes, you read that correctly. A goose. This nobleman, whose name is now lost to history but whose actions would be remembered for centuries, believed that the best way to enliven a tournament was to outfit a goose in full-plate armor and have it serve as his squire. The bird would accompany him to the joust, a symbol of his eccentricity and, perhaps, a statement of his noble wit. He had a custom-made set of miniature armor crafted for the goose, a tiny breastplate, a helmet, and even little armored boots for the bird's webbed feet. The nobleman introduced his new squire to the tournament with great pride, naming the goose Sir Hiss of the Pond, perhaps as an ironic nod to the serious nature of the joust. When the day of the tournament arrived, the spectacle unfolded as planned. The knights rode in with their shining armor, lances raised, and the crowd cheered for each brave display of strength and skill. But as the nobleman entered the jousting field, a great commotion broke out. On horseback, Sir Hiss strutted, proudly waddling across the field in his full suit of armor, his tiny head poking out of the top of the helmet, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation. The crowd was taken aback, unsure of whether this was an elaborate joke, or if they were truly witnessing a knight and his armored goose in full combat. And then, the unthinkable happened. During the joust, the goose, no doubt terrified by the raucous noise, the charging knights, and the chaos of the tournament, suddenly broke free from its handler. It flapped its wings wildly, its tiny armored body clattering against the stones of the tiltyard as it sped off into the chaos. The armored bird made a dash for freedom, flapping across the field, its armor glinting in the sunlight. The spectacle was so absurd that at first no one knew whether to laugh or take the situation seriously. But the goose, in its panic and confusion, had no sense of the boundaries of the jousting field, and the untrained bird began to cause havoc. In its frantic flight, it rammed into one of the horses, sending the steed into a wild panic. The frightened horse threw its rider, sending him crashing to the ground. The chaos quickly escalated. A second knight's horse bolted in response to the bird's sudden movements, and another knight lost control of his mount. A third knight, unable to maintain his balance, was knocked from his horse as well. The spectacle quickly descended into mayhem. The once proud knights, trained in the art of combat and mounted on their finest steeds, found themselves on the ground, injured or scrambling to regain control of their horses. Meanwhile, Sir Hiss continued to wreak havoc across the field, adding to the calamity. The goose had unwittingly brought the tournament to a halt. The once dignified event turned into a chaotic mess. The knights now engaged in an absurd battle with the animal. One can imagine the scene, a spectacle not of noble combat, but of knights flailing about, trying to catch or corral an armored goose that had no sense of the rules of the joust. When the dust settled, the bird was dead, fatally injured by the chaos it had caused, while the knights, fortunately, survived the ordeal with only minor injuries. The entire event left a bitter aftertaste of embarrassment. This was not the grand display of chivalric ideals that the tournament had been meant to be. No, it was an incident born of arrogance and absurdity, one that would echo across the courts of Europe in the years to come. The fallout from the incident, as absurd as it was, would eventually lead to a legal decree that had long-lasting consequences. The medieval authorities, looking to avoid any more catastrophic disruptions to jousting tournaments, passed a new law banning the dressing, arming, or mounting of animals in imitation of knights. The decree was both simple and comprehensive, forbidding any animals, beasts of burden, pets, or even fowl from being outfitted in armor or involved in any sort of knightly combat. The law extended to all domestic animals, marking a significant shift in how animals were perceived in relation to noble tournaments and combat. This law, though born of a single incident, carried with it ramifications that would ripple across Europe for years. It was a direct response to the chaos caused by the armored goose, but it also reflected the increasing attempts by medieval authorities to preserve the dignity of the knightly class and the image of chivalric combat. Jousting tournaments, after all, were not simply sporting events. They were political statements, demonstrations of a knight's wealth, skill, and loyalty. The last thing the nobles wanted was for their sacred rituals to be mocked by an animal running amok across the field. The law banning the dressing of animals in armor would remain in place for centuries, its origin lost to the annals of history, leaving future generations to ponder the bizarre causes behind its creation. Over time, the story of the jousting goose would become the stuff of legend, an absurd and humorous tale that would be passed down in jest, but also as a reminder of how one rogue animal, with no understanding of its role, could send the world of knighthood into disarray. What was once a symbol of noble competition of honor, skill, and prestige was now tainted by the memory of an armored bird. The medieval courts, always eager to protect their reputations, would find this incident hard to forget. It wasn't simply that the tournament was disrupted. It was that a nobleman's desire for a little amusement had changed the very course of jousting law. It was a stark reminder that, in the medieval world, even the smallest act of absurdity could lead to sweeping legal reform, sometimes with consequences far beyond what anyone could have predicted. The ban on animals participating in tournaments may have seemed like a trivial law in the grand scheme of history, but it had lasting effects on how the medieval world viewed knights, tournaments, and the sanctity of the joust. It reinforced the perception that the world of chivalry was sacred, a world in which nothing was to be allowed to disrupt the carefully crafted image of knighthood. For those who could look back on this absurd event, however, it became a symbol of the strange and often humorous logic of medieval law, where even the smallest incidents could have far-reaching consequences. And so, while the knights of the Middle Ages may have found their place on the battlefield with their lances and horses, they were also forced to reckon with the unexpected consequences of their own antics. The armored goose, though long forgotten by most, will forever remain a reminder that in the world of the medieval nobility, anything, even a bird in armor, could become the spark for legal change. The drunken joust, a knightly mishap. In the medieval world, jousting tournaments were much more than just displays of strength and skill. They were essential components of chivalric life, events that brought together the nobility in grand pageantry and competition. The clashing of lances, the gallant charge of horses, and the cheers of onlookers symbolized the very essence of knighthood, honor, prowess, and discipline. But the world of jousting, as grand and serious as it appeared, had a way of revealing the humanity, or lack thereof, of those involved. Beneath the polished armor, noble faces, and grand gestures, knights were often as fallible as any common man. This was especially evident in the notorious incident involving Count Heinrich von Schwarzburg, which would lead to a law that would forever change the nature of jousting tournaments. Count Heinrich von Schwarzburg was a nobleman of considerable repute, his name well known in the courts of Europe, both for his prowess in battle and his extravagance in life. He was, like many knights, expected to uphold the highest standards of conduct, bravery, loyalty, and, most importantly, sobriety. However, as was often the case in the world of medieval knights, the lines between piety and indulgence were easily blurred. The drinking culture among the nobility was pervasive, with wine flowing freely in feasts, celebrations, and even in the midst of battle. Yet knights were expected to drink with decorum, to be sober when they fought, and to demonstrate control even in their excess. This was, of course, an ideal more often aspired to than actually achieved. On one fateful day, a joust was announced to take place in the town of Frankfurt, a grand event where knights from all over the region would gather to demonstrate their skill and earn the admiration of the court. Among the attendees was Count Heinrich, a knight of great renown but known equally for his fondness for drink. The night before the tournament, the nobleman attended a lavish banquet, where the wine flowed freely and the atmosphere was filled with raucous laughter and merrymaking. The count, eager to demonstrate his skill in the joust the next day, consumed far more than his fair share of ale and wine. By the time the morning arrived, he was thoroughly intoxicated. Yet, as was common with the prideful and competitive knights of the era, he refused to bow out of the tournament. The show must go on, after all. Mounted on his horse, dressed in his finest armor, Count Heinrich entered the jousting field, his lance in hand and his senses far from sharp. The crowd cheered as he prepared for his turn in the tournament, not knowing the calamity that would soon unfold. His opponent, another knight from a rival house, stood opposite him, equally prepared but unaware of the perilous state his foe was in. The two knights charged, their lances aimed at one another with the force of centuries of tradition behind them. But there was a problem. Count Heinrich was not in full control of his faculties. As the two knights collided in the traditional joust, something went terribly wrong. The count's aim was off, his lance went astray, and he veered dangerously off course, losing control of his steed. In his erratic state, he accidentally veered into the stands, crashing into a group of onlookers. One of the casualties was a monk who had been watching the joust from a nearby bench. The monk was struck by the charging horse, thrown to the ground, and tragically killed by the impact. The scene was chaos. The crowd, initially thrilled by the display of bravery, was horrified by the tragic accident. Count Heinrich, now realizing what had occurred, staggered in his saddle, looking down at the body of the monk he had unintentionally killed. His mind, clouded by drink, could barely comprehend the severity of the situation. The tournament came to an abrupt halt, and medical attendants rushed to the monk's side, but it was too late. The nobleman was left standing in the middle of the field, his reputation forever tarnished by this one misstep. The repercussions of the incident were swift and severe. The church, horrified by the death of a holy man, called for immediate justice. Count Heinrich was brought before a tribunal, where both secular and ecclesiastical authorities scrutinized his actions. The nobleman's defense was weak, to say the least. His drunkenness was undeniable, and the monk's death, could not be ignored. The court, unable to overlook the gross negligence, decided that the Count's actions demanded a harsh penalty. While Count Hinrich was not executed for the incident, he was heavily fined and stripped of his titles for a period of time. But the punishment didn't end there. The church, concerned that such an incident might lead to further bloodshed in the future, took a more drastic step. It introduced a law banning knights from participating in jousts while under the influence of alcohol. This law, which may seem trivial to the modern observer, had far-reaching consequences. Not only did it impact the drinking culture of the medieval knightly class, but it also became a turning point in how tournaments were regulated and conducted. Jousting, which had been a sport of bravado and public spectacle, was now tightly controlled, with strict rules imposed on knights to ensure they were sober before they could take part in any official competition. The law also served as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked indulgence, and it placed a sharp focus on the moral image of knighthood, one that demanded discipline, control, and a commitment to chivalric ideals. In the years that followed, the law banning drunken jousting became more than just a legal decree. It became a symbol of the shifting priorities within medieval society. No longer could knights simply indulge in excess and expect to face no consequences. The ideal of the noble knight, tempered by virtue and discipline, was reinforced by this law, and it had a significant impact on the behavior of future generations of jousters. While knights were still allowed to drink after all, no one expected complete abstinence from the pleasures of wine and ale. They were now held accountable for their actions in a way that had never before been the case. The idea that knights could be above the law, able to engage in reckless behavior without consequence, was slowly fading, replaced by a culture of responsibility and self-control. However, this law did not entirely eliminate the drinking culture that had flourished in medieval courts. While it may have banned knights from competing in tournaments while intoxicated, it did little to curb the excesses of the feasts and celebrations that surrounded these events. The ban was more a formality, a recognition of the need to maintain decorum during the serious business of jousting, than a genuine attempt to address the root causes of drunkenness among knights. As a result, knights continued to indulge in heavy drinking at the banquets and feasts held after tournaments, often to the point of excess. But the difference now was that they were expected to maintain a semblance of sobriety during the actual combat, for fear of facing punishment. Over time, the impact of the drunken joust law spread beyond the specific event itself. It became a part of the larger shift in the moral and social values of the time. Chivalry, once seen as a code that allowed knights to indulge their whims and desires, was now evolving into a more disciplined, morally upright institution. The knights were no longer simply warriors. They were representatives of a noble ideal that demanded control, dignity, and responsibility. This new sense of accountability was a reflection of broader shifts in medieval society, where power was increasingly being measured by moral integrity rather than brute strength. The long-term effects of this law on medieval jousting were significant. Tournaments, once freewheeling displays of strength and skill, became more regulated, more formalized, and more closely associated with the concept of honor. The risk of death, once considered a natural outcome of such events, was now something that could be avoided if only the knights could maintain control over their own actions. The image of the knight, once that of a wild and untamed warrior, began to evolve into something more refined. It was an image of controlled power, of martial skill tempered by virtue, and of bravery balanced by responsibility. Despite this, however, the drinking culture remained deeply entrenched in medieval life. The knights, bound by their codes of conduct and the need to adhere to the law, learned to balance their indulgence with their duty. They drank, but they also fought with discipline. The memory of Count Hinrich and his ill-fated joust served as a warning to all who would follow, a reminder that even in the world of chivalric honor, there were limits to what one could get away with. In the end, the drunken joust of Count Hinrich von Schwarzburg was more than just a knightly mishap. It was a turning point in the history of medieval tournaments. It marked the end of an era of reckless abandon and the beginning of a more disciplined, regulated form of competition. While the knights of the Middle Ages would continue to face challenges, both on and off the field, This one incident was enough to alter the course of jousting forever. It reminded all who participated that sometimes the greatest honor was found in knowing when to put down the wine and pick up the lance. The royal bread fiasco, a misplaced royal symbol. The Middle Ages were a time of dramatic contradictions on one hand, an era of chivalric grandeur, castles, and divine rule. On the other, a world fraught with superstitions, unwritten rules, and absurdities that could change the course of one's life forever. In this strange and often dangerous world, even the most innocuous acts could spark a chain of events leading to catastrophic consequences. One such event took place in medieval London, where the simple act of a baker creating a loaf of bread shaped like a royal crown led to accusations of treason, a public trial, and the enactment of a law that would forever change the course of culinary and political expression. It all began in the bustling streets of London, a city teeming with life, trade, and creativity. At the heart of this medieval metropolis, bakers worked tirelessly to provide fresh loaves for the citizens, often creating intricate and elaborate designs to please their customers. One such baker, known only by his trade and his craft, had long been known for his attention to detail and skill in shaping his bread. For most of his career, his creations were unremarkable simple loaves, perhaps a few pastries, but one day he decided to create something special. It was a time of great political tension, a time when the monarchy and the common people were locked in a delicate balance of power. King Richard II ruled the kingdom, and with the crown came not only the trappings of power but also the reverence of the people. The royal image was sacred, and anything that even remotely threatened that image was viewed with suspicion. This baker, in the spirit of creative expression, chose to craft a loaf of bread unlike any he had ever baked before, a loaf in the shape of a crown. Now, it's important to understand the significance of this act. To a baker, bread was more than just sustenance. It was an art form. The intricate designs were meant to delight the eyes as much as they satisfied the stomach. But to the crown, symbolism was power. And in the hands of a simple baker, the creation of a loaf that resembled the royal crown was not just a culinary choice. It was seen as an act of defiance, a rebellion against the monarchy itself. The loaf in question was designed with the finest of details, the dough shaped meticulously into the form of a crown, with delicate loops and swirls mimicking the regal diadem worn by the king. It was intended to be a show of respect, a tribute to the monarchy, but it would prove to be anything but that. The bread went on sale in the market square, and soon word spread of its unusual design. People stopped by, marveling at the intricate craftsmanship and admiring the boldness of the baker. But before long, the royal guards were alerted. Someone had noticed the similarity between the loaf and the crown, and the whispers began to circulate. Was the baker mocking the king? Was he daring to challenge the crown in the most subtle of ways? Could this seemingly innocent loaf be a symbol of rebellion? What followed was a series of events so absurd that they could have been ripped from the pages of a medieval farce. The baker, initially unaware of the gravity of his creation, was arrested on charges of treason. The accusation was that by baking a loaf shaped like the royal crown, he was implicitly undermining the monarchy and showing disrespect to the king. His intent, of course, was never to defy the crown, but in the feverish, paranoid atmosphere of the time, intent mattered little. What was more important was the symbolism, and to some, that was enough to justify drastic action. The trial of the baker became a spectacle. A full courtroom was assembled, with nobles, clergy, and royal representatives in attendance. The defense, of course, argued that it was merely a bread design, an innocent act of culinary creativity, with no intent to offend or insult. The prosecutor, on the other hand, seized upon the symbolism of the loaf, suggesting that it was a subtle insult to the crown, a rebellion disguised as bread. The entire case revolved around one question: could the loaf have been a deliberate insult, or was it simply a mistake? The trial became a national debate, one that involved not just the baker's fate, but the very essence of royal symbolism. Should the monarchy be so fragile that a loaf of bread could bring down the crown? Or was this merely a case of overzealous political control, an attempt to quash even the smallest rebellion before it could take root? The baker, terrified by the proceedings, found himself trapped in a legal web where the boundaries between artistry, political symbolism, and treason became increasingly blurred. In the end, the court delivered its judgment. The baker was fined heavily and publicly humiliated. But the consequences of this bizarre incident didn't stop there. The case had caused such a stir that the monarchy, in its determination to preserve its image and control, enacted a law that would forever change the way royal symbols were used and misused by the public. The law, which was passed swiftly after the trial, stated that no person was allowed to create, sell, or distribute food items that resembled royal symbols, such as the crown or the scepter, without express permission from the crown itself. This law had far-reaching implications, not just for bakers, but for artists, craftsmen, and anyone who dealt with the creation of symbols in any form. The monarchy's fear of mockery, of subversive symbolism, led to a crackdown on free expression in ways that had never been imagined before. The law became a tool to enforce conformity and to ensure that the monarchy's image was protected at all costs, even in the most mundane of everyday objects. For the baker, the consequences were severe. His business, once thriving, became a pariah. No one dared purchase from him again, fearing the wrath of the crown. His once celebrated creativity had turned against him, and his life as a baker in London came to a bitter end. The royal image, it seemed, was too precious to be tinkered with, even in something as innocuous as bread. The public reaction to the law was mixed. On one hand, many supported the idea of protecting the crown's image, seeing the law as a necessary safeguard against rebellion and disrespect. On the other hand, many found it absurd, an overreaction to what could have simply been a mistake. The royal family's desperate need to control every symbol of power, down to the shape of bread, revealed the fragile ego of the monarchy. And for many, that fragility was its own form of weakness. In the years that followed, the law became a strange footnote in the history of medieval life, a reminder of how deeply the monarchy feared mockery. Yet it also had a profound impact on the world of free expression. No longer could artists, bakers, or even the common folk engage in the kind of creative symbolism that had once been a hallmark of medieval life. Every design, every depiction of the crown, had to be approved by the king. A simple loaf of bread had led to the stifling of creativity, and the monarchy's overreach was now embedded in the laws of the land. As the years passed, the story of the royal bread fiasco faded into the background of history. The laws that followed it became less of a concern, and the symbolism of bread, once a powerful political statement, was lost in the daily grind of medieval life. But for those who lived through it, the memory of the baker's fateful loaf lingered, a testament to the absurd lengths to which the monarchy would go to protect its image. In a world where power was as fragile as a loaf of bread, it was clear that even the most innocent of acts could become a dangerous symbol, and the consequences of that symbol could echo through history for centuries to come. The mystery of the drunken fish, medieval fish laws. In the Middle Ages, the line between the logical and the absurd was often indistinguishable, and nowhere was this more evident than in the strange laws that governed society. While many of these laws were rooted in real-world problems, disease, crime, and social unrest, some emerged from the bizarre and the unexpected. One such law, perhaps one of the most absurd to ever be enacted, was the direct result of an incident involving a nobleman, his prized fish, and an accusation that would lead to an entire legal system governing the behavior of animals in relation to alcohol. It was a sweltering summer day in the mid-15th century, in the English village of Catterick, located within the borders of North Yorkshire. The tale of Lord Humphrey of Catterick, a wealthy and powerful nobleman, would soon become one of the most talked about incidents in the region, not because of the political intrigue or the grandeur of his title, but because of a bizarre accusation that would change the course of local law forever. Lord Humphrey was a man with many passions, but none more so than his deep affection for his private fish pond, a serene body of water nestled within the grounds of his sprawling estate. The pond was no ordinary fishery. It was home to some of the finest and most sought-after fish in the region, particularly the prized carp that Lord Humphrey took great pride in. These fish were not simply creatures he had a fondness for. They were symbolic of his wealth and status, a living testament to his ability to cultivate beauty in even the most ordinary aspects of his life. One day, after returning from a particularly arduous day of administrative duties, Lord Humphrey went to inspect his fish, as was his ritual. He was particularly fond of one carp in particular, a large, vibrant creature he had named Maggot, after his father's old nickname for him. The fish had been swimming erratically, darting around the pond in a manner unlike its usual calm movements. Lord Humphrey, not one for superstition, dismissed it at first, but over the course of the next few days, the behavior of his fish seemed increasingly erratic, as though they had been, well, drunk. Lord Humphrey, a man known for his impulsive nature, could not let the matter lie. He summoned his closest servants and aides, insisting that something sinister was at play. The fish were clearly behaving in a way that suggested they were under the influence of something. But what could cause such a transformation? After all, no one had ever accused the fish of misbehavior in the past. The answer came from one of Lord Humphrey's more suspicious servants, who, after much questioning, revealed something startling. The villagers had been pouring ale into the pond. The accusations were laughable, even to Lord Humphrey himself, but the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that this was the source of the problem. What other explanation could there be for such unusual behavior from his beloved fish? The idea that the fish had been drunk was absurd, but in an age where many things were governed by superstition and ignorance, it was not entirely outside the realm of possibility. The villagers, when questioned about this peculiar act, denied it vehemently. Some even laughed it off as a prank gone too far, claiming they had simply been having a bit of fun and did not expect such consequences. However, Lord Humphrey was not satisfied with this explanation. He accused the villagers of malicious intent, arguing that their actions were aimed at ruining his prized fish, and perhaps even mocking his nobility. There were rumors that some villagers had done this not out of malice, but simply because they wanted to get a laugh at the expense of the Lord's ridiculous attachment to his pond. The situation quickly escalated. A town meeting was called, and soon the local magistrate, along with a group of witnesses, gathered to investigate. But what could be done? The villagers maintained their innocence, and the nobleman was insistent on holding them accountable. The trial, at first, seemed a strange and inconsequential event. After all, who would take the actions of a few drunken villagers seriously? Yet the implications of this bizarre scenario were about to unfold in ways no one could have anticipated. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that something had to be done. Lord Humphrey, driven by a mixture of pride and frustration, demanded retribution. The villagers were charged with the destruction of property, namely his prized fish, and for poisoning his pond with ale. But as the proceedings dragged on, it became evident that there was no clear evidence to support the idea that the villagers had indeed poisoned the pond intentionally. The fish's erratic behavior, some argued, was simply the result of natural causes, or perhaps a mere coincidence. In the end, no one could prove definitively what had caused the fish's behavior, but Lord Humphrey, unwilling to let the matter slide, went a step further. He argued that there should be legal ramifications for anyone who dared interfere with another's animals, especially in such a peculiar and mischievous manner. His suggestion was met with shock and confusion, but the seed of an idea had been planted. A law was passed, known henceforth as the Drunken Fish Law, which prohibited the act of pouring alcohol or any other intoxicating substances into water sources that contained living animals. The law was a direct result of Lord Humphrey's bizarre accusation and became part of a larger pattern of legal actions that were tied to the strange events of medieval life. The law was not just about protecting fish, but about enforcing respect for animals and maintaining order in an unpredictable world. It was meant to prevent further absurdities like the one Lord Humphrey had witnessed and, most importantly, to safeguard the delicate balance between human activity and the natural world. The consequences of this law reverberated throughout the local and surrounding regions. It quickly became part of the legal code in neighboring villages, where similar incidents, sometimes involving accusations of animal mistreatment or bizarre, inexplicable events, had occurred. Some towns even began to pass additional regulations, such as fines for anyone who was caught feeding animals in a manner deemed inappropriate by local authorities. Beyond its immediate effects, the Drunken Fish Law was symbolic of the medieval mindset toward nature. While medieval society was increasingly influenced by the growing power of the church and its teachings, it also reflected the superstitions and misunderstandings that pervaded daily life. People often believed that nature, including animals, was governed by unseen forces, and that even the smallest transgressions could have far-reaching consequences. Whether it was the influence of the divine or the meddling of the natural world, the line between what was seen as acceptable and what was considered offensive was often drawn in strange, illogical ways. As for Lord Humphrey, the incident would become a mark on his legacy, not one of glory or greatness, but of absurdity and overreach. His desire for retribution had led to a law that, while seemingly harmless in its intent, became emblematic of the medieval impulse to create rules in response to the most bizarre and ridiculous events. The tale of the drunken fish, though rarely remembered today, lived on in legal history as an example of how one strange and absurd event could spark an entire category of laws that would shape the course of society for years to come. And so, the medieval world marched on, where even the most trivial of incidents could lead to the creation of laws with lasting societal impact. The drunken fish law, absurd as it was, remained a testament to the chaotic, unpredictable, and sometimes comically serious world of medieval justice. Through it all, one thing was certain. In the world of medieval laws, no incident, no matter how strange, was too insignificant to be immortalized in legal code. And in the case of Lord Humphrey and his drunken fish, that immortality took the form of a law that would forever be remembered as one of the oddest in history. The monks who sang too loudly, the first medieval noise complaint. In the 14th century, within the stone walls of a secluded monastery, nestled deep in the hills of Italy, an unremarkable yet transformative event unfolded. It began, as many rebellious acts do, with something as simple as a song. The story of how a group of monks inadvertently sparked the first medieval noise complaint is both humorous and revealing of the era's complex relationship between faith, authority, and creativity. This tale is not one of a grand political revolution or a bloody battle for power, but rather, it revolves around an art form, music, and the way it threatened to break the centuries-old silence of monastic life. At the time, Gregorian chant was the heart of liturgical music within the Christian Church. Its solemn, measured tones had been refined over centuries and were considered the purest expression of faith. The monks who lived in monasteries dedicated their lives to prayer, meditation, and work, with their days structured around the hours of devotion. Music, for them, was not merely an artistic endeavor. It was a means of connecting with God, of giving voice to the divine and to the eternal. The sounds of the Gregorian chant filled the chapels during services, echoing off the ancient stone walls like the murmurs of the heavens. To introduce anything else into that sacred silence was unthinkable. But, as with many things in the medieval world, change came slowly, sometimes in subtle, unsuspecting ways. It all started in a small Italian monastery, where a group of particularly creative and curious monks began to get restless. Life within the monastic walls could be rigorous and repetitive, with the monks following strict schedules and performing the same daily rituals. They were tasked with following the ancient rules of their order, and within the structure of Gregorian chant, they found both discipline and comfort. But as they spent years in their cloisters, they began to experiment, exploring the limits of their musical expressions. One night, after a long day of prayer, a few of the younger monks started humming tunes outside of the sacred canon. Perhaps it began innocently enough, a playful variation of a chant, a simple and innocent foray into something secular. At first, it was just a passing amusement, a way to unwind after a particularly grueling day. However, as days turned into weeks, their experimentation grew bolder. They began to mix Gregorian chants with popular secular melodies of the time, the lively, upbeat songs of troubadours that had been circulating throughout Italy and beyond. These melodies were different from the somber hymns they had been raised on. They were lively, they were rhythmic, and they were, well, secular. The other monks, particularly those of the older generation, were appalled by this. For them, the sanctity of their music was tied directly to their faith. The introduction of secular music into the monastery was not just a breach of discipline, it was a sacrilege. a corruption of the sacred. They viewed the addition of worldly melodies to their sacred chants as an affront to God himself. Worse still, the sounds they were producing were not just mere variations, they were loud, exuberant, and, to the more conservative monks, downright improper. At first, the situation remained manageable. The rebellious monks sang their tunes in secret, hidden away in corners of the monastery during the hours of rest. But as their music began to grow more popular among the younger members of the order, the noise increased. The halls of the monastery, once silent except for the whispers of prayer and the sacred chants, were now alive with the sounds of merriment. These new songs were often heard echoing through the cloisters late into the evening, long after the curfew for prayer had passed. This growing unrest did not go unnoticed by the head of the monastery, an elderly abbot who had devoted his entire life to the preservation of monastic discipline. He was a man of strict routines, a man who viewed silence as a reflection of the divine. To him, the intrusion of secular music into the monastery was not just an act of rebellion, it was a challenge to the very foundations of monastic life. The abbot, who was known for his temper, found himself growing increasingly agitated as the nights grew louder with the sound of foot-stomping tunes and impromptu performances. One evening, after a particularly loud outburst of music, the abbot could take no more. He called an emergency meeting of the senior monks. They gathered in the dim light of the monastery's great hall, the air heavy with incense, the walls thick with the silence of centuries. The abbot stood before them, red-faced and stern, his voice shaking with anger. "It has come to my attention," he began, "that our sacred order has been defiled by music that does not belong. The holy chants we have dedicated our lives to are now being drowned out by the laughter and frivolity of secular tunes. This is a violation of everything we stand for." End quote. The younger monks, who had introduced the new music, sat quietly, their faces reddened in shame, yet also filled with a kind of defiance. They had never meant to cause harm, only to express their joy through the gift of song. But they understood the gravity of their actions. They knew they had crossed a line. The abbot's anger only grew, and soon the matter was escalated to the local bishop, who was called upon to arbitrate the dispute. The bishop, though sympathetic to the monks' desire for creative expression, was a man of the church, and he could not condone what he saw as a breach of tradition. After consulting with the regional council of clergy, it was decreed that the monks had violated the sacred silence of the monastic life. The punishment, as decreed by the bishop, was swift and harsh. A new rule was instituted that would forever change the course of monastic music in Europe. A law was passed that prohibited the singing of secular tunes after sunset within monastic walls. This new decree, which became known as the Sunset Silence Rule, stipulated that no monk was allowed to sing or perform anything other than Gregorian chants after the evening bell. The purpose was clear: to preserve the sanctity and discipline of monastic life, and to ensure that music, the sacred art of the church, remained free of secular influence. The new law sent shockwaves through the monasteries of Europe. It was seen as both a necessary corrective and a crushing blow to artistic expression. Many monasteries adopted this new rule, and soon it became commonplace throughout Italy, France, and the rest of Europe. The sunset silence rule was enforced with great rigor, and violators were subject to punishment, ranging from fasting to temporary exile from their cloisters. But what was most surprising about this law, in hindsight, was the unintended consequence of the monks' rebelliousness. The ban on secular music, though restrictive, created a new space for innovation. In response to the prohibition of secular songs, many monks began experimenting with more intricate forms of sacred music. Gregorian chant itself began to evolve, incorporating more harmonies and complex structures that would lay the foundation for what would eventually become polyphony, the multi-voiced music that became the hallmark of Western classical music. Thus, what had begun as a rebellion against monastic rules inadvertently contributed to the development of one of the most significant musical movements in history. The very monks who had broken the rules helped push the boundaries of sacred music, forever altering the course of Western musical tradition. The very thing they had been reprimanded for, the inclusion of secular elements into their sacred chants, sowed the seeds for a new and more elaborate form of music that would come to dominate the medieval and Renaissance periods. In a sense, these monks, despite their punishment and the subsequent laws that silenced their creativity, had made an indelible mark on history. Their rebellion against the constraints of tradition, though it led to a momentary crisis within the monastery, ultimately led to the flowering of music as a profound art form that would shape the cultural landscape for centuries to come. And so, the story of the monks who sang too loudly lives on as an ironic reminder of how even the most well-intentioned rules can spark innovation. What was once a strict, silent rule became the very foundation of a musical revolution. The notorious royal goose law. In the pages of medieval history, some stories are so absurd, so strikingly bizarre, that they transcend time, becoming legends that make us laugh, scratch our heads, and wonder how on earth such things could ever have been allowed to happen. One such tale involves a knight, a goose, and the birth of one of the most outlandish laws in medieval Europe. This is the story of the Royal Goose Law, a tale that intertwines the eccentricity of the aristocracy with the chaos that often defined medieval tournaments. It's a story that reminds us just how strange, and at times comically ridiculous, the rules of royal life could be. It all began in the late 14th century, in the heart of Europe, during a grand jousting tournament. The joust, a centuries-old tradition where knights proved their courage, strength, and skill in a test of combat, was a spectacle unlike any other. The sound of clashing lances, the pounding hooves of war horses, and the cheers of onlookers filled the air. Nobles and knights from far and wide gathered, dressed in their finest armor and bright banners, eager to display their prowess in the ancient art of jousting. But amidst the pageantry and the spectacle, one knight in particular decided that he would add something a little unexpected to the tournament. It wasn't enough for him to simply ride into the joust with his usual weaponry and armor. No, this knight, whose name has been lost to history, decided to take his participation a step further. He introduced an animal into the tournament, a bird no less, but not just any bird. He brought with him a fully armored goose. Yes, you read that right, a goose, fully armored, dressed in tiny plate armor, complete with a miniature helmet and everything. The knight, ever the showman, had apparently commissioned a custom suit of armor, designed specifically for his squire of the avian variety. He paraded the bird around the jousting field, displaying it like an odd but proud companion. To make things even more absurd, he named the goose Sir Hiss of the Pond, a title befitting of a noble warrior. The knight's intention was simple: to entertain, to astonish, and perhaps to show off a little. But this was no longer just a quirky knight's personal amusement. The joust was a public event, watched by nobles, commoners, and even the clergy. When the goose, clad in its shining metal garb, made its dramatic entrance, the crowd couldn't help but laugh. It was a ridiculous sight, certainly, but no one could have predicted the chaos that would soon unfold. In the midst of the joust, as the knight prepared to face off against his opponent, something unexpected happened. The goose, presumably startled by the loud noise of the tournament, flapped its wings and began to panic. In a wild dash, the bird escaped from its handler and took off across the jousting field. In an instant, the carefully orchestrated battle between knights turned into a scene of utter chaos. The armored goose, flapping and honking in a frenzy, collided with the squire of another knight. The squire, trying to catch the bird, was knocked off his feet and accidentally tripped the horse of another jouster. The horse, frightened by the commotion, reared and threw its rider, sending the tournament spiraling into confusion. What followed was a spectacle that left no one unaffected. The goose, still flapping wildly, crashed into the legs of another horse, causing yet another fall. A domino effect of confusion ensued, with knights falling from their horses, lances flying in every direction, and spectators running for cover. It was, in short, a disaster. When the dust finally settled, 3 knights had been injured, the goose was dead, presumably from its injuries or sheer exhaustion, and the audience was left in stunned silence. The absurdity of the incident was not lost on the authorities. Rather than laugh it off or move on, The event was taken seriously by the local lords and the ruling class, who saw it as a breach of tournament decorum. The chaos of the joust, instigated by a bird in armor, was deemed too great to be ignored. What had started as a joke, a knight showing off his strange companion, had turned into a legal conundrum. The authorities, seeing the potential for further disruptions in future tournaments, reacted in the only way they knew how, by passing a law. Soon after the incident, a new decree was issued across the region, a law banning the dressing, arming, or mounting of animals in any tournament, whether jousting or otherwise. The law was designed to prevent any future goose-related incidents, as the authorities put it. No animal, be it a goose, a dog, or any other creature, was to be dressed in armor or allowed to participate in any knightly activities. It was a bizarre yet necessary reaction to the absurdity that had unfolded in the joust. The law, formalized with all the pomp and ceremony of any royal decree, became known as the Royal Goose Law. The effects of this law were far-reaching, rippling out into the broader medieval culture. It wasn't just about the goose. Of course, it was about the consequences of unchecked foolishness and the need for order in a world that, all too often, relied on tradition to keep the peace. The incident became an object lesson in the absurdity of aristocratic behavior, and the law became a symbol of the rigid control that the ruling classes had over their environment. It reflected the lengths to which medieval society would go to maintain the dignity of its institutions, even if that meant regulating the behavior of animals. As the years passed, the Royal Goose Law became a fixture in legal discussions regarding tournament conduct. It was discussed, joked about, and referenced in various legal texts throughout Europe. The story of the armored goose, once a laughingstock, was now considered an example of the dangers of overindulgence and the need for decorum. It also served as a cautionary tale about the absurdity of the medieval aristocracy, a reminder that sometimes the wealthy and powerful could be just as ridiculous as anyone else. The law, however, had unintended consequences beyond the immediate world of jousting tournaments. It sparked a broader discussion about the role of animals in medieval society and the growing need for laws that regulated the treatment of creatures, both domesticated and wild. Though the Royal Goose Law was somewhat humorous in its origins, it helped lay the groundwork for more serious discussions about animal rights, something that would not be fully developed until many centuries later. Over time, the story of the knight and his armored goose became a beloved tale in the annals of medieval history. It was told and retold in jest, becoming a symbol of the absurdity that could arise from the intersection of nobility and ridiculous behavior. And while the law that followed was born out of one chaotic event, it served as a reminder that even the most eccentric of actions could have far-reaching consequences, and that, in the end, even the most ridiculous of laws could be taken seriously by the powers that be. Thus, from one knight's ridiculous attempt to add flair to his jousting routine, a law was born that forever changed the nature of tournaments and the rules surrounding animal participation. The Royal Goose Law, though born out of chaos, became one of the many strange and absurd examples of medieval legal history, a testament to the eccentricities of the aristocracy and the often ridiculous lengths to which society would go to preserve its traditions. The law of the bishop's bell. In the Middle Ages, superstition and faith were tightly woven into the fabric of everyday life. The events of the time were often marked by what seemed like divine intervention, and rulers, nobles, and the clergy alike were quick to interpret seemingly ordinary occurrences as signs from God. However, sometimes, those signs were far from what anyone expected, especially when it came to the mysterious case of the runaway church bell of 1,324 inches, the French town of Autun. It was a day like any other in this quiet, rural French village. The citizens went about their daily lives, attending to their work, their families, and their prayers, unaware that an incident would soon unfold that would alter the course of history, at least in a small, absurd way. The local parish had just received a beautiful new church bell, a large, ornate piece of metalwork, commissioned to hang in the newly constructed tower of the town's cathedral. The bell was a symbol of the village's wealth and religious devotion, its purpose to call the people to prayer and mark significant events, such as births, deaths, and weddings. It was, as many things were in the medieval period, more than just a piece of craftsmanship. It was a representation of the divine, a sacred object meant to inspire reverence. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The bell was installed with great care, a large bronze object that towered over the cathedral, shining in the sunlight. It had been carefully blessed by the local priest, and the townsfolk had gathered to witness the ceremonial ringing. The event was supposed to be a joyous occasion, an affirmation of the church's power and influence. The bell was to serve as a beacon, a reminder of God's presence in the town. But in the midst of this blessed moment, something unexpected happened. A powerful thunderstorm swept across the region, dark clouds gathering overhead as lightning cracked through the sky. It wasn't unusual for a storm to pass through the village after all. Storms were as much a part of life in medieval France as the changing of the seasons. What was unusual, however, was what happened next. As the storm raged, a bolt of lightning struck the church tower, a sharp flash that illuminated the sky and shook the earth beneath the villagers' feet. The force of the strike was so great that it jarred the new bell loose from its place in the tower. The bell, previously secured by ropes and pulleys, fell from the tower. However, rather than tumbling to the ground in a dramatic crash, it instead rolled down the church steps with a force that seemed almost preordained. The lightning strike had set the bell free, as though it had been given its own will and purpose. The bell didn't just fall, it rolled with intention, smashing through the streets of the village as if it were possessed by some mischievous spirit. It crushed barrels, toppled market stalls, and even struck down a few chickens along the way, all while the villagers watched in stunned silence. The scene was one of chaos and confusion. People ran in all directions as the bell made its way through the streets, its massive weight causing destruction wherever it went. The bell finally came to rest in a fruit cart, a rather anticlimactic end for such a majestic symbol. But the damage had already been done. The bell's journey through the streets of Autun had caused such a commotion that it could not be ignored. As if in response to the storm, the bell had taken on a life of its own, becoming an unstoppable force of nature that couldn't be tamed. Naturally, the events that followed the Rogue Bell incident were met with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and amusement. The local bishop, who had been present during the ceremony, was less than pleased with the damage caused by the bell's unsanctioned journey. His displeasure was rooted not just in the physical destruction but in the symbolic implications of the incident. In the medieval world, bells were not just pieces of metal. They were vessels of divine authority, meant to ring with the power of God's will. The idea that a bell, an object of divine order, could be so easily dislodged and made to act on its own was deeply unsettling. After the dust settled, and the bell was retrieved from the cart, the bishop convened a council with the town's leaders to discuss the incident. The situation was serious enough to warrant action, and the church could not allow such a breach of order to stand. The concept of divine intervention was a powerful one, and the idea that an object as sacred as a church bell could behave in such a chaotic manner was more than just a joke. It was an affront to the very foundation of church and state. The local church was supposed to represent stability and divine authority, and the bell's rogue behavior had cast doubt on that authority. It didn't take long for the bishop and his council to draw up a decree that would forever change the way church bells were treated in France. The new law, known as the Law of the Bishop's Bell, was simple but direct. From that point forward, all church bells were to be securely chained or fastened to prevent them from escaping their towers. The church could not allow another incident like this to occur, where a symbol of divine power could be reduced to a rampaging object of chaos. The law also required that all new bells be blessed by the church before they could be rung, ensuring that no bell could be used to call the people to prayer unless it had first been properly consecrated. The Law of the Bishop's Bell became a symbol of the medieval obsession with order, control, and the regulation of every aspect of life. It wasn't just about preventing further incidents like the one in Autun. It was about asserting control over everything in the world, even inanimate objects. Bells, which had once been seen as mere instruments of sound, were now viewed as potential threats to the stability of society, and the church had to ensure that nothing, not even a bell, could disrupt the divine order. The law had far-reaching consequences, not just for the town of Autun, but for churches across France and beyond. The incident of the runaway bell quickly spread across Europe, becoming a popular tale that was shared in taverns, markets, and courts. It was discussed by theologians, debated by scholars, and used as a cautionary tale by religious leaders. And while the story may have started out as a simple accident, a freak occurrence caused by lightning, it quickly became a symbol of the need for absolute control over the world, no matter how absurd or inanimate the subject may be. In the years that followed, the law of the bishop's bell was adopted in other parts of Europe, and its influence can still be seen today. Bells were treated with the utmost reverence, and the idea that something as sacred as a church bell could act without divine guidance seemed anathema to the medieval worldview. Even centuries later, the story of the runaway bell remained a part of local folklore, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, even the most innocuous objects could be viewed as agents of divine will or chaos. The rogue bell incident of 1,324 inches Autun serves as a striking example of the medieval mindset, one that was obsessed with order and control, even when it came to inanimate objects. The law of the bishop's bell, though it may seem laughable to us today, reflects the deep-seated belief that nothing in the world was exempt from divine oversight. In medieval Europe, everything, from the actions of men to the behavior of bells, had to be regulated, for fear that chaos would reign. And so, while the runaway bell may have rolled its way into history as one of the most absurd incidents of the time, its legacy lived on. The law that was born from that strange event became a lasting symbol of the medieval obsession with order, a reminder that in a world ruled by faith and superstition, even the slightest disruption could cause a ripple effect that would shape the course of history. The bell that fled the tower was not just an object of chaos. It was a catalyst for the creation of a law that would forever bind church bells to the hands of ecclesiastical authority, ensuring that even inanimate objects could not escape the reach of the divine. The whistling law of Germany. In the stillness of medieval Germany, where the night held the kind of quiet only broken by the sounds of distant animals or the occasional murmur of a village in slumber, one man's innocent habit would ignite a series of events that would lead to one of the strangest laws in history. This story takes us back to the 13th century, to a small town along the Rhine River, where a shepherd's whistling would forever alter the quiet evening hours for generations to come. The shepherd, known only as Hans, was a simple man. He worked diligently, tending to his flock of sheep in the countryside, a place where solitude and nature intertwined. His work was solitary, yet he found comfort in the sounds of the natural world, the rustling of trees, the calls of birds, and his own whistling. To Hans, the practice was not just a way to pass the time, it was a form of expression, a melody to soothe both him and his sheep as they roamed the vast fields. The simple tune that rolled off his lips, a soft and rhythmic whistle, carried on the wind, as it had for years. But Hans did not anticipate the ripple effect his whistling would cause. One fateful evening, as dusk settled over the town, Hans found himself wandering along the narrow path near the village's outer gate. He had just finished his work for the day, and the sheep were grazing quietly, settled into the gentle embrace of the coming night. The cool air swept through the trees, rustling the leaves in a soft dance. As Hans made his way back toward the village, he began to whistle a tune, low and peaceful, that had become his signature melody. Unfortunately for Hans, this simple pleasure was about to come to an abrupt end. As Hans was lost in his rhythm, not far from the village, a noblewoman named Lady Gertrude was traveling home from an evening event. She was seated in her carriage, surrounded by servants and attendants, making her way through the village gates when, to her shock, she heard the piercing sound of whistling cutting through the otherwise quiet air. The whistling, though not loud enough to warrant immediate distress, grated on her nerves. It was the dead of night, after all, and such noise was a rare disturbance in the otherwise serene landscape. At first, Lady Gertrude tried to ignore the sound, but it persisted, a soft, continuous melody weaving through the air as the carriage clattered along the cobblestone streets. Frustrated, she signaled for the driver to slow down. She leaned out of the window, peering into the dimming countryside, and spotted the source of the noise. There, not far from the road, was Hans, walking in the moonlight, his hands tucked behind him as he casually whistled to himself, completely unaware of the disruption he was causing. Lady Gertrude, already fatigued from her evening engagements, was not pleased by the interruption. Her life was filled with the hustle and bustle of courtly duties and noble affairs, where silence and decorum were expected in every aspect of life. Her reaction was swift and fierce. She instructed her driver to halt, and before Hans even realized what was happening, she summoned one of her servants to approach him. "You!" the servant barked at Hans, startling him. "What are you doing disturbing the peace at this hour? Do you have no respect for the noble ladies of this land?" Hans, confused and unsure of what had prompted the outburst, stammered in his defense. I was just whistling to my sheep, m'lady. It's what I do to calm them. I didn't mean to disturb anyone." End 4. But Lady Gertrude would not have it. In her eyes, Hans's act of whistling in the quiet of the night had been an act of disrespect. She saw it not just as an irritation, but as an affront to her aristocratic status. After all, she was a noblewoman, and even the countryside should bow to her grace and poise. A mere shepherd had no right to impose his song upon the night that belonged to those of higher standing. The altercation that followed was not one that Hans could have anticipated. A small crowd began to gather, as such events often do, when a noblewoman raises her voice in indignation. Soon, word spread through the town, and the local magistrate was called to settle the matter. It became a topic of debate, as the villagers, who often knew Hans as a hard-working but harmless man, couldn't understand how his whistling could possibly merit such an extreme reaction. But to Lady Gertrude, it was clear. This was a matter of public order. She believed that no one, especially not the lower classes, should disturb the quietude of her journey or intrude upon the social order that she represented. After some discussion and the intervention of a few influential townsfolk, it was decided that Hans would be summoned before the local council to answer for his actions. The trial that followed was a bizarre spectacle. The villagers gathered not for a serious legal proceeding, but out of curiosity. The courtroom, a simple chamber in the town hall, became the stage for a legal farce. Hans, now the center of attention, stood before the council, his hat in his hands, unsure of how his innocent habit had become a matter of such importance. Lady Gertrude, sitting with a haughty demeanor, explained that she had been disturbed by the public nuisance of Hans' whistling and demanded that something be done about it. The magistrates, faced with an absurd situation, could do little but go along with Lady Gertrude's demands. They ruled that, as a matter of public order, whistling in public should be banned after sunset. It was not just a minor inconvenience. It was an affront to the social hierarchy and a breach of the peace. The law would extend beyond just Hans to any person who, in the future, might think it appropriate to make noise after nightfall. And so, from that day forward, the whistling law was enacted in the town, and eventually, it spread to several neighboring provinces. The implications of this law were far-reaching, though not in the way one might expect. While it seems trivial today, the law represented the medieval obsession with maintaining order and hierarchy, even in the most mundane aspects of life. Whistling, a simple expression of joy or habit, became a symbol of public disorder, something that could disturb the peace of the night and upset the balance of power in society. It was an act of rebellion, no matter how minor, that threatened the smooth running of the social order. In the eyes of the aristocracy, the law was a necessary safeguard to preserve peace, dignity, and control. As time went on, the whistling law became an urban legend in the region. It was passed down through generations, often with a humorous twist, as people laughed at the absurdity of such a law being enacted because of one shepherd's whistle. The story became a point of ridicule, a reminder that even the smallest transgressions could become the foundation of an entire legal framework in the medieval world. For those who knew the story, the law was a symbol of both the authority of the elite and the absurdity of how the smallest of events could spiral into something much greater. In the years that followed, the law took on an even deeper psychological significance. It became a warning against the power of the elite to control even the most trivial aspects of life. Whistling, once a simple act of expression, now became something to fear, something that could land you in trouble with the law. And for the common people, the story of Hans and the whistling law served as a reminder that in a world ruled by aristocrats, Even a joyful sound could be punished if it stepped out of line. As time went on, the law became less of a literal ruling and more of a cultural anecdote. People stopped worrying about the legal ramifications of whistling after sunset, but the lesson remained. The story of the whistling law lived on in folklore, a reminder of how power, class, and the absurdity of life often came together in the most unexpected ways. Even the most seemingly trivial acts of rebellion, like a shepherd whistling to his sheep, could lead to a law that would be remembered for centuries. In the end, the whistling law became more than just a legal decree. It became a part of the larger cultural memory of medieval society, a symbol of how order, control, and absurdity could intersect in a world where the powerful could reshape the world with the stroke of a pen. It was not the law itself that endured, but the story of how one man's simple joy led to an entire legal movement that would live on in the annals of history. The laws of royal drink, the clashing sound of steel against steel, the roar of the crowd, the thunderous charge of knights on horseback, these were the familiar sights and sounds of a jousting tournament in the medieval world. But behind the spectacle, beneath the polished armor and the ceremonial pomp, there was often a darker, more reckless element to the knight's behavior. This is a story of how one night's excessive drinking led to the creation of a law that would shape the very essence of what it meant to be a knight, and how that law would forever change the culture of chivalry. The year was 1364, a time when jousting tournaments were the epitome of medieval sport. Knights, noblemen from every corner of Europe, gathered in grand spectacles to display their skill, honor, and valor. The competition was fierce, and the stakes were high. But it was not only the battlefield that would determine a knight's worth, it was also the customs, the rituals, and, as some would argue, the indulgence in vice. Count Heinrich von Schwarzburg was a nobleman known throughout the region for his bravery and prowess in the joust. He was tall, imposing, and revered by his peers for his reputation in combat. Yet, there was one thing that marred his otherwise prestigious record: his love of alcohol. It was no secret that Count Heinrich had a penchant for drinking, especially before tournaments, where the thrill of the battle was often enhanced by a few too many flagons of wine. And as was customary among knights, alcohol served as both a social lubricant and a form of bravado, proof of one's ability to withstand the rigors of battle, to drink deeply and fight fiercely. But one fateful joust would change everything. On the morning of a highly anticipated tournament, Count Heinrich, as was his custom, had indulged in an ample amount of wine. The night before had been filled with celebrations, feasts, laughter, and songs that echoed through the halls of the castle. The wine flowed freely, and Count Heinrich had partaken more than most. Despite his inebriation, he was determined to compete, to show his peers that no matter how much he drank, he would still ride with the courage and precision of a true knight. The joust began like any other, with knights galloping at full speed, their lances aimed at their opponents. The crowd cheered, the banners fluttered, and the excitement was palpable. But as Count Heinrich charged toward his first opponent, something went terribly wrong. In the haze of drunkenness, his aim was off, his balance unstable. His lance missed its mark, and he was thrown from his horse with a crash that sent shockwaves through the onlookers. The tournament paused as the crowd gasped in horror. The fall had not been an ordinary one. Count Heinrich's body had collided with one of the wooden supports of the tilt yard, and the force of the impact was enough to render him unconscious. His squire rushed to his side, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and Count Heinrich, still wearing his armor, died from the injuries sustained in the fall. The crowd, initially thrilled by the tournament spectacle, was now hushed with a heavy silence. The tragedy that had unfolded in the blink of an eye would not soon be forgotten. The aftermath of the incident was swift and dramatic. A nobleman of such stature dying in a tournament was a rare and shameful occurrence. The knights, who had spent years cultivating their reputations as symbols of honor, discipline, and courage, were shaken. But even more so, the event cast a shadow on the very institution of chivalry. How could a knight, one who was supposed to be the epitome of discipline and control, allow himself to be so reckless as to drink before such a critical contest? The answer was clear to many. The relationship between knights and alcohol had gone too far. In the wake of Count Heinrich's death, a council was convened to discuss the tragedy. The king, upon hearing of the event, was furious. He saw this as a stain upon the honor of the knights, and a dangerous precedent that could tarnish the reputation of chivalry itself. It was a stark reminder that the line between tradition and excess was dangerously thin. The noblemen, who had gathered for the tournament, knew that they could not allow such an incident to happen again. It was not just about the loss of a life. It was about the integrity of their order, the symbol of knights as paragons of virtue and strength. And so, the law of the royal drink was born. It was a decree that no knight could compete in any tournament or engage in any form of combat while under the influence of alcohol. This new law was passed with the force of royal authority, and its implications rippled throughout the kingdom. It was a direct response to the death of Count Hinrich, and it sought to restore the dignity and discipline of the knightly class. But while the law may have been intended to maintain order and promote discipline, it did not come without its complications. The law was seen as a direct attack on the culture of the knights, who had long enjoyed the camaraderie and tradition of drinking before battle. For centuries, it had been a ritual, an act of bonding and bravery that set them apart from common soldiers. To deny that tradition, to tell knights that they could no longer indulge before the tilt, was a blow to their sense of identity. Knights were not easily swayed by the new law, and there was a great deal of resistance. Many knights, particularly the older and more entrenched members of the order, viewed the decree as an overreach of royal power. They believed that their ability to drink and fight was part of what made them men of honor. To be told that they could no longer drink before a tournament was seen by some as an insult, a denial of their autonomy. However, as time went on, the law began to take root. The tragic death of Count Hinrich had made its mark, and the event slowly became part of the collective memory of the knightly class. The knights learned to adapt. Drinking before tournaments became a thing of the past, replaced by a new, more restrained code of conduct. The law, though initially met with resistance, began to reshape the behavior of knights across the kingdom. But even as the law was adopted, it did not erase the underlying tension between tradition and survival. The knights continued to face the pressures of their roles. They were expected to be fierce warriors, loyal to their lords, but also symbols of moral virtue. The tension between these conflicting expectations was not easily resolved. Some knights, particularly the younger generation, saw the law as an opportunity for a new era of chivalry, one that was free from the excesses of the past. Others, particularly the older knights, mourned the loss of the tradition that had defined their order for so long. Over time, however, the law had a lasting impact on the culture of knights and jousting tournaments. The image of the sober, disciplined knight became the standard. The law was enforced strictly, and the specter of the drunken joust never again haunted the field. In the wake of Count Hinrich's death, the knights adopted a new code of conduct that reflected their changing values. The knightly image, once associated with excess and indulgence, now became a symbol of control and honor. In the years following the establishment of the royal drink law, jousting tournaments evolved. The knights who competed were no longer those who indulged in excess before the battle. Instead, they were trained to remain sober, focused, and disciplined. The tournaments, which had once been fueled by a dangerous combination of honor and inebriation, were now serious contests of skill, strategy, and strength. But the story of Count Hinrich von Schwarzburg and the law he inadvertently helped create would not be forgotten. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most sacred traditions could be pushed too far, and that even the noblest of men could fall victim to their own excesses. The royal drink law, while initially a reaction to one knight's tragic death, ultimately shaped the future of medieval jousting and the culture of chivalry, ensuring that knights would be remembered not just for their courage and skill, but for their discipline and restraint. The legacy of that law would echo through the centuries, influencing the behavior of knights and forever changing the way the Royal Duck Scandal. The Royal Duck Scandal is one of the more bizarre tales to come out of medieval history, a story that intertwines the absurd with the serious, the comedic with the unsettling. It begins with an ordinary duck and ends with a ripple of change across royal courts, not only altering how animals were treated, but also reflecting the often surprising intersections between power, pride, and public image in the Middle Ages. It all began on a crisp autumn day in the late 14th century, in the bustling heart of the royal court of a small kingdom. This particular court, like many others of the time, was a place where appearances were paramount, and the monarchy's image was a matter of utmost importance. King Aldrich, a ruler known more for his pomp than his wisdom, had surrounded himself with a retinue of advisors, courtiers, and officials who were quick to react to anything that could potentially mar the royal dignity. The king's palace was a place where even the smallest mistake could become a scandal, and where every piece of gossip, every slight, was carefully monitored by the ever-watchful eyes of the court. Now, it is important to understand the climate in which this incident took place. The medieval court was a strange beast, filled with intrigue, competition, and an overwhelming need to maintain control over every aspect of life. The monarch was expected to represent the divine will on earth, anointed by God, and thus every act, every movement had to be impeccably regal. It was a world where appearances mattered more than substance, and any perceived blemish on the monarchy's image could have catastrophic consequences. This meant that everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest servant, was continually aware of the potential for disgrace. Even the animals of the court were not exempt from this scrutiny. So, when the royal groundskeeper found himself face to face with an incident involving one of the royal ducks, he likely had no idea that he would be the one to set off a chain of events that would lead to one of the most absurd and unsettling incidents in the kingdom's history. The duck in question was a particularly troublesome creature, a black-feathered bird that had been a favorite among the king's courtiers. For weeks, it had been causing minor havoc around the royal gardens. From stealing food from the kitchens to disrupting royal feasts, it seemed that this particular duck was hell-bent on making life difficult for everyone who crossed its path. It had no respect for the courtiers or their status, often waddling through the royal halls with impunity, creating a nuisance in the otherwise pristine palace grounds. It was during one of these chaotic moments that the duck crossed paths with the royal steward, Sir Geoffrey, a man whose obsession with maintaining order in the palace had earned him both admiration and disdain. Sir Geoffrey was known for his quick temper and his extreme commitment to preserving the dignity of the royal household. He did not take kindly to the antics of a mere duck, especially when it began to cause havoc during a state dinner. The duck had wandered into the grand hall during an important banquet with foreign diplomats, its quacking distracting from the serious discussions at hand. Sir Geoffrey, his patience already worn thin by the strain of the evening, could not bear the further humiliation. In an unprecedented fit of rage, he ordered the duck to be removed from the hall. But the duck, with an air of defiance that was both hilarious and maddening, refused to leave. It waddled about, flapping its wings and causing chaos among the guests. In a moment of frustration and irrationality, Sir Geoffrey had the duck seized, tied up, and taken before the royal court for its misdeeds. The charge? Disrupting the royal proceedings and disturbing the dignity of the crown. And so, the trial of the royal duck began. To the surprise of many, the entire court gathered for the trial. A defense was summoned for the animal, though the very idea of a lawyer defending a bird seemed absurd to most of the assembled nobles. Nonetheless, the royal legal system was notorious for its intricacies and, at times, for its utter lack of common sense, and this trial was no exception. The duck was formally accused of disrupting the royal order, a crime that, in the eyes of Sir Geoffrey, demanded severe punishment. What followed was a spectacle that baffled both the court and the kingdom. The judge, a pompous and deeply serious man, heard testimony from various members of the court who had witnessed the duck's disruptive behavior. Sir Geoffrey, appearing before the court, passionately argued that the duck's actions were a direct affront to the king's dignity. He even went as far as to suggest that the duck's behavior could have been a deliberate act of defiance, possibly orchestrated by some unseen enemy within the palace. The defense, however, was a farce. The lawyer assigned to represent the duck, an unfortunate fellow who had been called from his afternoon nap, argued, in an incredibly strained voice, that the duck could not be held accountable for its actions, as it was an animal and could not possibly understand the gravity of its behavior. The court, however, was not swayed by such logic. The trial, steeped in absurdity, ended with the court declaring the duck guilty of disturbing the royal proceedings, and it was sentenced to death. The execution, fittingly, took place in the presence of an enthralled audience. The duck was paraded before the court in a mock procession, its wings flapping helplessly as it was led to the gallows. A rope was tied around its neck, and it was hanged in front of the assembled nobles. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the bird, so full of life only moments before, was reduced to nothing more than a symbol of the court's strange obsession with power and control. The fallout from the royal duck trial was immediate and far-reaching. The absurdity of the event was too much for many to bear, and word of the trial spread quickly throughout the kingdom. The common people, who had long viewed the royal court with a mix of admiration and suspicion, were outraged. How could such a ridiculous trial have taken place, they wondered, when there were far more important matters to address? The image of the king's court, once a symbol of power and prestige, had been irrevocably tarnished by the senseless death of a bird. In response to the outcry, the king, desperate to maintain the dignity of the crown, issued a decree. A new law was passed, banning any act of cruelty toward animals in royal courts. The law stipulated that no animal, be it a horse, a dog, or even a duck, could be subjected to mistreatment or public execution without proper ecclesiastical permission. The law, which would later come to be known as the Royal Animal Welfare Act, marked a significant shift in medieval thought. The image of animals as property or mere tools to serve the nobility had begun to erode, if only slightly, under the pressure of public outcry. Yet the law itself was not about a newfound compassion for animals. It was, as many royal laws were, a matter of preserving the monarchy's dignity. The royal image, after all, had been marred by the needless cruelty of a royal official. The law was less a gesture of kindness toward animals, and more a calculated move to restore the crown's public image, to repair the damage done by a ludicrous event that had unfolded before the eyes of the kingdom. The incident, however, did not end with the passing of the law. It became part of the royal legend, a strange chapter in the history of the monarchy. The story of the royal duck trial was passed down through generations, an absurd tale that, in time, became more a symbol of the medieval court's eccentricity than any lesson in animal rights or justice. The law, for all its implications, remained largely a formality, rarely invoked, and soon forgotten by most. In the years that followed, the royal duck scandal became a subject of whispered jokes and light-hearted gossip in the royal court. But to those who remembered, it was a vivid reminder of the medieval court's preoccupation with maintaining its image at all costs, even if it meant making a mockery of itself. The duck, long dead and forgotten, had become a symbol of that obsession. It had, in its strange way, shaped the future of royal law and the kingdom's view on dignity, power, and the limits of authority. And so, the story of the royal duck, both amusing and unsettling, was woven into the fabric of history. It reminded all who heard it that even in the most powerful courts, even amidst the grandeur of kings and queens, the absurd could rise up, change the course of law, and leave a lasting mark on society. The deadly laws of poisoned food. The history of royal courts is filled with opulence, grandeur, and extravagant banquets. Kings and queens dined on elaborate feasts, each course more sumptuous than the last, while courtiers and nobles gathered in fine halls beneath glittering chandeliers. But behind the luxury and the merriment, there was a silent, unseen danger that lurked at every banquet, the constant threat of poisoning. And at the heart of this danger was a profession that was both coveted and tragic: royal food tasters. It was during the late 13th century, in a kingdom where intrigue ran as deep as the wealth, that the role of the royal food taster became an official and deadly profession. The monarch, King Edward IV of England, had long been troubled by whispers of poisoning among the court. His enemies, both within and outside the kingdom, would stop at nothing to see him removed from the throne. In an age when betrayal was often a whispered word away, food could easily be turned into a weapon. At the time, there was no shortage of enemies to whom the art of poisoning was second nature. Assassins, rivals, even ambitious courtiers, any one of them could slip a deadly dose of toxin into the royal cup or feast. To safeguard his life, King Edward took a step that many monarchs before him had feared to take. he hired a food taster. This taster's sole responsibility was to take the first bite or sip of every dish and drink served to the king. If the taster survived, the food was deemed safe for the monarch. If the taster died, then the king's dinner would be immediately discarded, and the cooks would be interrogated. The royal taster's life became one of constant anxiety, for each meal, each banquet, could very well be their last. And while the king could live in luxury and enjoy his food without fear, the taster had to face the terrifying uncertainty of whether the next bite would be their final one. The taster, a man by the name of Gerard, had long been known for his iron stomach and exceptional health. He was a servant of the court, but he was respected by many for his quick wit and his knowledge of herbs and poisons. His role was vital to the safety of the monarchy. The food tasters were often drawn from among the lower ranks, but they became invaluable to the royal family, as no banquet could take place without one. The job was both dangerous and well compensated, with food tasters receiving a handsome stipend, as well as generous gifts for their service. However, there was an unspoken understanding that their life was constantly at risk. One fateful day, the royal court prepared for a lavish banquet in celebration of an important diplomatic alliance. The air was thick with excitement, and the hallways echoed with the sounds of preparation. The grand table was to be set with dishes fit for royalty: roasted meats, exotic fruits, delicate pastries, and sweet wines from distant lands. The king had invited foreign dignitaries, and every effort was made to ensure the meal was perfect. Gerard stood before the table, his heart pounding with every course as it was brought to the king. Each dish was inspected by the chefs, but Gerard knew it was his duty to be the first to sample it. The first course arrived, a rich stew garnished with herbs and spices. Gerard took a small spoonful, as was customary, and waited. Minutes passed, and he felt no ill effects. He nodded to the king's chef, signaling that the stew was safe. The next course followed, a delicate fish glistening under the light. Gerard took another bite, and again he felt no discomfort. The evening seemed to be going smoothly. But then, as the final course arrived, a decadent dessert made with figs, honey, and dark chocolate, Gerard's stomach churned. The first bite tasted fine, but soon after, a burning sensation crept through his chest, a sensation that rapidly escalated to a searing pain. He gasped for breath, and before he could call out for help, he collapsed on the floor, convulsing. His face turned pale, and his body went limp. A deadly silence fell over the room as the court watched in horror. The royal taster, the very man who had protected the king from death so many times before, had succumbed to poison. It was said that the dessert had been tampered with, the chocolate laced with a deadly dose of hemlock. The king's enemies had succeeded, not through force, but through cunning and a silent weapon: poison. The food taster had paid the price for his king's safety, and his sacrifice would become the catalyst for an even darker chapter in royal history. The tragedy of Gerard's death rocked the court, but it also led to an immediate change in how food testing was conducted. The royal family, shaken by the loss, passed a new law requiring more than just a food taster's word to ensure the safety of royal meals. No longer would a single taster be responsible for the king's life. Instead, the law mandated that multiple tasters, chosen from among the most trusted and skilled servants, would be required to test each dish. Furthermore, each taster would be expected to report any unusual tastes, smells, or reactions. The law also stipulated that these tasters undergo training in the identification of common poisons and their antidotes. The royal chefs were now required to prepare each dish in a way that made it nearly impossible for poisons to be added unnoticed. In addition, the royal court began to employ trained physicians, apothecaries, and even alchemists to oversee the safety of royal meals. These experts would use their knowledge to examine the food for potential toxins before it was even served. For a time, it seemed that the court had done everything in its power to protect the king from the threat of poisoning. However, despite these precautions, the psychological toll of the job on the food tasters was immense. For years, Gerard had been the trusted servant who ate first. But now, the new tasters lived in constant fear. The job had gone from a simple act of duty to one of immense psychological strain. Each meal became a life or death situation, and many of the new tasters began to suffer from paranoia, insomnia, and anxiety. The thought of eating, or worse, drinking was enough to cause some to decline the job altogether. Some even resorted to strange rituals to protect themselves, carrying charms or wearing blessed amulets to ward off the threat of poisoning. In an effort to address the growing fear among the tasters, the court passed another law, a law of protection and compensation. Any taster who died in service to the king would be buried with royal honors, and their family would receive a generous pension for their sacrifice. The law also granted royal tasters immunity from punishment in cases of accidental mistakes, as long as they had followed the prescribed testing procedures. The intent was to relieve some of the emotional and mental burden from those tasked with the job, though the reality was that the job was never truly safe. But the strangest consequence of Gerard's death and the laws that followed was the growing distrust between the monarch and his court. The king, once unafraid to indulge in extravagant meals and sumptuous banquets, now found himself suspicious of every dish that came before him. His court became a place of silent tension, where even the smallest act of trust, such as sharing a meal, was fraught with fear. No longer could the king sit down to a banquet without wondering who among those seated with him might wish him dead. And so, the laws regarding food tasters and food safety became a permanent part of royal life. In some ways, they were a response to one of the greatest fears a monarch could have, the fear of betrayal from within. It was not a blade or a dagger that could kill a king in the Middle Ages, but the quiet, unseen threat of poison. The royal food tasters, once considered mere servants, had become the unsung heroes of the court, living in the shadows of both trust and fear. They served in silence, knowing that each meal might be their last. In the end, the tragic death of Gerard and the resulting laws would have far-reaching consequences not only for the royal court, but for the kingdom as a whole. The regulation of food safety became a cornerstone of royal protocol, and the psychological strain of living in constant fear of poisoning became ingrained in the culture of the court. The legacy of these laws would endure for centuries, influencing the way food and power were intertwined in royal and noble circles, and reminding us of the silent, invisible dangers that lurk behind the lavish banquets and grand feasts of medieval courts. The Forbidden Foods Law. In the grand and glittering courts of the medieval world, where banquets were held to celebrate power, wealth, and triumph, the very food served was imbued with far more than just sustenance. The dishes presented to a monarch and his court weren't just a reflection of culinary skill, but also of the kingdom's strength, purity, and divine favor. Meals were meticulously crafted, each dish carefully chosen to reflect the status of the monarchy and maintain its reputation as the epitome of refinement and power. But within this perfect world of lavish feasts, there lurked an invisible and sometimes dangerous threat: food itself. Though the royal court was a place of indulgence and excess, the very foods consumed by royalty could shape not only their health but their public image. In the medieval mindset, food had spiritual, cultural, and political implications. A single misstep could send the wrong message, tarnish the reputation of the royal family, and even undermine the power of the monarchy. Thus, certain foods became forbidden in royal consumption, either because they were considered unclean, their effects on health were unpredictable, or, most troubling of all, they were thought to possess the power to undermine the very image of the monarchy. These forbidden foods were no small matter. They were the subject of laws and edicts that sought to protect the king and his court from the potential dangers of these substances, both real and imagined. It is important to note that during the Middle Ages, ideas about food and its effects were far different from our modern understanding of nutrition and health. In this world, food was not simply a matter of filling one's stomach. It had the power to affect one's soul, image, and reputation. Just as certain foods were believed to hold medicinal or healing powers, others were thought to carry risks that could bring misfortune, illness, or even death. At the heart of these concerns was the monarchy's need to maintain an image of invulnerability, purity, and divine favor. One such food, widely banned from royal tables, was shellfish. In many parts of medieval Europe, shellfish were considered dangerous and unclean, primarily because of their tendency to spoil quickly. In a time when refrigeration was centuries away, food spoilage could be a deadly problem. Shellfish, being coastal creatures, were especially prone to rapid decomposition, and the risk of foodborne illness was high. But beyond practical health concerns, shellfish was also viewed with a sense of suspicion by the royal courts, due to its association with the common folk and their less sophisticated diets. To consume shellfish was to partake in food that was considered coarse, cheap, and, in some circles, even vile. It was also believed that the consumption of shellfish could have a negative impact on one's health both physically and spiritually. Shellfish were often associated with moral impurity, and their consumption was thought to be a sign of decadence or excess. For the royal family, indulging in shellfish could be seen as an act of carelessness, one that undermined their position as the model of health, virtue, and divine favor. As such, they were banned from the royal table, with strict laws in place to ensure that no member of the court would dare to indulge in the so-called sinful delicacy. In a kingdom where food was a reflection of power, the forbidden status of shellfish sent a strong message. The monarchy was above such things. The king's diet, and by extension his health, was not to be sullied by the lowly fare of the peasantry. But shellfish was not the only food to fall under the scrutiny of royal law. Another notorious example of a forbidden food in the medieval royal court was beef. In the early Middle Ages, beef was not only regarded as a peasant's meal but also linked with negative connotations. The image of the powerful monarch and his court required foods that were both light and refined, not the heavy, coarse meat of a cow. As strange as it may seem today, beef was thought to be too earthy for royalty. It was simply too plain and common to be considered appropriate for a king's feast. This perspective was also rooted in the symbolic importance of food. Kings and nobles were often expected to eat in ways that demonstrated their elevated status, and the idea of consuming something as commonplace as beef would have seemed beneath them. The beef ban became a symbolic gesture of the separation between the monarchy and the masses. The delicate meals that graced the royal tables, often consisting of venison, game birds, and luxurious fish, were designed to reflect the king's divine status and transcendence from earthly concerns. Beef, as a food that was often associated with laborers and the lower classes, had no place in this royal vision. Furthermore, some foods were banned because of the potential dangers they posed to the royal family's health. The idea of consuming toxic foods was not unfamiliar to medieval minds, and certain foods were banned due to their association with dangerous properties. One example was the infamous swan's nest, a dish served at banquets in the royal courts of France. A rare delicacy, the swan's nest was made by preparing the eggs of swans, which were thought to carry mystical properties. However, in some cases, these eggs were contaminated with harmful bacteria or toxins, leading to illness. The eggs were considered too risky for royal consumption, and the dish was eventually banned. The ban on swan's nest was just one example of how the royal courts carefully regulated their meals to ensure the safety and image of the monarchy. Kings, queens, and their courtiers needed to maintain an image of invulnerability, and any food that could potentially cause harm to their health was considered a liability. In a time when medicine was rudimentary at best, foodborne illness could be devastating, and the risks of consuming certain foods were too great to ignore. Just as they had outlawed shellfish and beef, the royal court enacted laws to prohibit other potentially dangerous foods. But the most ironic of all these laws was the prohibition of the consumption of fruit, specifically apples. Apples were once a highly sought-after delicacy in royal courts, but they too were eventually banned. The reason? Poison. In a world where poison was a common weapon for political and personal gain, apples were thought to be one of the easiest ways to administer poison covertly. A single drop of toxin could easily be hidden inside the flesh of an apple. And since apples were a popular fruit at royal feasts, the risk was too high for comfort. It became illegal for anyone, including the royal family, to eat apples without the king's express permission. The irony of this law was not lost on anyone. A fruit that had once symbolized life, health, and vitality had been turned into a symbol of danger, fear, and political conspiracy. As time went on, these laws surrounding food consumption grew stricter, reflecting the increasing paranoia that came with royal power. The the political implications of food became more pronounced, and even the smallest change in the royal diet could have far-reaching consequences. The banning of certain foods, from shellfish to swan's nest to apples, became a way for monarchs to assert their power and their control over the image of the royal family. The food on the royal table was no longer just about nourishment. It had become a reflection of the monarchy's strength, purity, and divine right to rule. The forbidden foods, however, had unintended consequences. As laws against certain foods were passed, they didn't just impact the royal court, they influenced society as a whole. The medieval food laws shaped social norms, creating divisions between what was acceptable for the common people to eat and what was reserved for the elite. The bans on certain foods became a way for the monarchy to control its image and to reinforce its status as the ruling class. The legacy of the Forbidden Foods Law endures in the way we view food today, through both cultural symbolism and health-conscious choices. Just as medieval monarchs used food to project their power and status, modern leaders and elites continue to do so, though perhaps in less obvious ways. However, the laws enacted in the medieval period to protect the monarchy's image serve as a reminder of how deeply intertwined food, power, and politics have always been. As we reflect on the royal food laws of the Middle Ages, we see how these seemingly trivial regulations, whether concerning shellfish, beef, or even apples, were rooted in a deep-seated need for control. For the medieval monarchs, food was far more than just sustenance. It was a tool of power, a means of protecting their image, and a way to shape the way the world saw them. And, in the end, food, with its symbolic weight and hidden dangers, proved to be one of the most important and powerful weapons in the royal arsenal. The royal trial of the cockroach. In the grand candlelit halls of a medieval noble's court, amid the flickering shadows cast by the high stone walls, feasts were regularly held, glorious celebrations of power, wealth, and the monarchy's prestige. For the nobility, dining was a moment of grandeur, a time to showcase their sophistication, to indulge in fine foods, and to display the highest standards of etiquette. The banquets were elaborate affairs, meticulously prepared, with every detail accounted for. The wine flowed freely, the meats were roasted to perfection, and the finest pastries graced the tables. But for all the majesty that these royal feasts represented, they were not without their challenges. As the banquet hall filled with the laughter and chatter of noblemen and women, there lurked a constant, almost unnoticed threat, one that was both common and irritating, yet for the aristocracy, utterly beneath their station. It was not a matter of the political intrigues or whispered secrets that often swirled around these gatherings. It was something far more mundane, far more disturbing: a cockroach. In the year 1345, in a court located deep within the heart of medieval France, an event occurred that would go down in history as one of the most absurd and, at the same time, one of the most significant legal precedents in the history of royal dining. It all began on a particularly warm evening during a grand banquet held in honor of an important diplomatic guest from a neighboring kingdom. The table was laid with a variety of dishes, from roasted venison to a feast of fruits and exotic vegetables, as was customary for royal occasions. Nobles, in their finest garb, sat eagerly awaiting the evening's entertainment, music, poetry, and the company of the finest minds and wealthiest patrons in the land. It was in the midst of this highly formal event, as the guests were beginning to relax into the evening's revelry, that the unthinkable occurred. At the very moment the host, Lord Pierre de Marais, was preparing to toast his honored guest, a small but significant disruption took place. A cockroach, no bigger than a silver coin, scurried across the floor of the great hall. It made its way toward the long table, which was laden with platters of fresh food, its dark, greasy body moving unnoticed for the moment by the guests. But then, in an instant, disaster struck. One of the most renowned ladies of the court, Lady Eleanor, a woman celebrated for her grace and beauty, caught sight of the unwelcome intruder. In a fit of hysterical terror, she shrieked loudly, slamming her hand onto the table and knocking over a goblet of wine. The noble guests gasped, startled by the sudden outburst. Their attention shifted from the diplomatic conversation to the lady's distress. As she recoiled in disgust, the cockroach scuttled further along the floor, drawing more attention as it made its way across the lavishly decorated table. The ripple effect of the disturbance was immediate. Servants rushed to clear the wine. Guests murmured in disbelief, and Lord Pierre, clearly discomfited, attempted to regain control of the event. Yet the cockroach did not simply disrupt the atmosphere. It represented, in the minds of many present, a direct assault on the royal dignity. Here, in this most sacred and high-class space, where nobility was expected to maintain the utmost control and composure, this tiny creature had caused a scene, disrupted the evening, and, most importantly, defiled the royal meal. The very presence of the cockroach was seen as an insult, a challenge to the sanctity of the court. At that moment, Lord Pierre's sense of propriety was tested. Rather than dismissing the incident as an unfortunate but minor event, he chose to treat it as a challenge to the royal status. Determined to protect the dignity of his court and the honor of his guests, Lord Pierre declared that the cockroach would be put to trial. He summoned the court's chief legal advisor, and within moments, a small, makeshift tribunal was set up right in the heart of the banquet hall, as if to remind the guests of the absolute authority of the noble class. The cockroach was captured and placed in a small wooden box, its fate sealed. The trial that ensued was as absurd as it was swift. A public defender, though the cockroach hardly needed one, was appointed by Lord Pierre, and the insect was formally charged with causing disruption, contamination, and insult to the noble dinner. The case, though clearly a farce, took on the seriousness of a trial. The noblemen, many of whom had never witnessed such an event, watched with eager curiosity as the legal formalities unfolded. The court, made up of men and women in fine robes, listened intently as the prosecution argued that the cockroach's appearance had disrupted the meal and sullied the courtly atmosphere. They claimed the creature had potentially tainted the food with its filth and bacteria, even though no evidence was provided that the cockroach had touched any of the food. The defense, however, did little to contest the charges. They argued, in a rather unconvincing manner, that the cockroach was merely acting according to its instincts and should not be blamed for the chaos it had caused. Ultimately, the court returned a verdict of guilt. The cockroach, accused of bringing dishonor and disorder to the royal feast, was sentenced to death. In an act of utter absurdity, Lord Pierre decreed that the cockroach would be executed publicly, as a symbol of the law's uncompromising authority. The punishment for the insect was swift and brutal. It was to be squashed beneath the heel of the royal guard, an execution that was witnessed by all in attendance. The aftermath of the trial was immediate. The event, though ridiculous to modern eyes, caused a stir across Europe. News of the trial spread quickly, reaching the courts of other noble families and even the church. As much as it was laughed at, the symbolism of the trial was not lost on those in power. The incident, though centered on a cockroach, represented a broader concern: the need for order and control in all aspects of royal life. If a mere insect could challenge the authority of the court, what other disruptions might lie in wait? In the wake of the royal trial, a new law was passed in Lord Pierre's kingdom. It required that all animals within the royal courts, pests or otherwise, be subjected to trials before punishment could be meted out. Furthermore, any disruption caused by animals, whether it was a bug scuttling across the floor or a larger animal in the court, had to be considered an affront to the monarchy's dignity. The law stated that animals, including vermin, were to be dealt with according to strict legal procedures, with trials before execution. A designated court official was even appointed to oversee the proper handling of animals in the court, ensuring that no creature could disrupt the royal court without due process. While the law may have seemed trivial, its implications were far-reaching. It led to the creation of an entire category of legal proceedings dedicated to the management of pests and animals in the royal court. Soon, the practice of holding trials for animals became a peculiar and widespread tradition throughout Europe. It was an example of how even the smallest, most insignificant events could inspire lasting legal reforms. The absurdity of the cockroach trial echoed through history, and as bizarre as it was, it demonstrated how even the smallest symbol of disorder could be met with bureaucratic precision. The law also reflected the medieval mindset toward order and control. In a time when society was governed by strict hierarchies and a deeply ingrained sense of divine authority, The very idea of an animal disrupting royal proceedings was considered a grave offense. It wasn't just about maintaining cleanliness or protecting public health. It was about maintaining the monarchy's image of divine authority and unshakable order. A cockroach, in this context, was no longer just an insect. It was an enemy of the crown. The trial of the cockroach became a strange symbol of the medieval obsession with order. It was a reminder that even the most trivial of disruptions could lead to significant consequences. And as the law spread to neighboring kingdoms, it led to a fascinating period in which courts across Europe continued to hold trials for animals, goats, pigs, cows, even roosters who had been accused of crimes ranging from immorality to trespassing. In the end, the legacy of the royal trial of the cockroach was far more than a strange historical anecdote. It was an early lesson in how medieval society saw the intersection of the natural world, the royal court, and the rule of law. In a world where every event, no matter how small, had the potential to challenge the authority of the monarchy, the trial of a cockroach stood as a testament to the lengths to which the medieval world would go to maintain control, even if it meant putting a bug on trial. The spectacle of royal dining, performance, and power. In the grand, echoing halls of medieval castles, royal dining was not just about food. It was a stage, a performance, where every meal, every bite, and every gesture held profound social and political meaning. These banquets were not simply opportunities to indulge in lavish meals, but intricate displays of power, carefully choreographed to reinforce the hierarchy and maintain control over both the court and the realm. It was a world where what you ate, how you ate it, and who you ate it with could define your place in the complex web of medieval politics. Imagine the scene: a long, polished wooden table draped in ornate linens, heavy with the finest meats, cheeses, and wines from across the land. The rich scent of roasting venison and fresh-baked bread fills the air, mingling with the musky perfume of courtiers in velvet and silk. Knights, nobles, and ladies of the court sit in their finest attire, their every move watched with keen eyes. Every gesture, from the manner in which a goblet is raised to the polite exchange of words, is an integral part of the royal spectacle. And, of course, this performance is not just for the guests seated around the table. There are also those watching from the shadows, observing and recording, ready to adjust the delicate balance of power if needed. But these performances weren't always elegant or harmonious. In fact, many of the laws governing royal dining were born out of bizarre incidents, small breaches of etiquette, or the fear that the royal court might lose its carefully constructed image of control and dignity. Beneath the surface of these seemingly trivial laws, there was a far-reaching web of manipulation and control. Each new rule, whether it was about what could be eaten, how it could be served, or who could be seated, was a deliberate move to maintain the power structure within the royal court and beyond. One of the most telling aspects of medieval royal dining was the way food laws acted as a reflection of the political landscape. In a society defined by rigid hierarchies and ever-shifting alliances, even the simplest act of eating was a reflection of one's status, loyalty, and power. For instance, a king might dictate which foods were considered acceptable for certain individuals to consume, determining who could eat with whom and when. A peasant might be forbidden from eating at the same table as a noble, reinforcing the class divide that was so ingrained in medieval society. The very structure of a meal could be a political statement, a way of reinforcing who was in charge and who was meant to serve. But it wasn't just about class distinction. The rules of royal dining were also about control. Control over what was consumed, how it was consumed, and who was allowed to make those decisions. There were laws that dictated the way food was prepared, who could prepare it, and who had the right to enjoy it. Only the most trusted chefs, often men who were politically loyal to the monarch, were allowed to prepare the royal meals. This wasn't just a matter of taste or culinary expertise. It was about who had access to the monarch's table and, by extension, who had influence over royal decisions. A trusted chef could hold immense power in the court, not because of his ability to cook, but because his position granted him access to the inner circle of the monarchy. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of these dining laws was how they played into the manipulation of royal image. Each meal served at a royal banquet was a spectacle, carefully crafted to project an image of power, wealth, and divine right. This performance was designed not only to entertain but to remind the courtiers, the subjects, and any visiting foreign dignitaries of the majesty of the monarchy. A grand banquet, laden with exotic dishes and delicate wines, was as much about displaying the royal wealth as it was about appeasing the nobility. It was an unspoken message to the court. Look at what we control. Look at how we rule. But sometimes these performances went too far. Sometimes they were too grand, too excessive, and the excess became a symbol of royal hubris. Laws were introduced to curb this, to remind the monarchs that they were not above the law or the eyes of their people. Excessive feasting became a point of contention in the royal court. One particular law, which arose after an incident where a monarch's greed for exotic foods led to the near ruin of a feast, banned the consumption of certain foods that were seen as unnecessary or indulgent. The law dictated that no meat could be served that had not been slaughtered in a humble manner. This was a direct response to the extravagant indulgences of some monarchs who sought to impress their court with the most outlandish and expensive foods, from peacock eggs to dishes prepared with spices from the farthest reaches of the empire. While some may have seen this law as a reasonable act of moderation, it was also a tool of political control. The monarchs who passed such laws sought to maintain an image of responsibility and humility, especially during times of war or famine. They wanted to demonstrate that they were not just rulers of land, but rulers of their appetites. By restricting the consumption of overly extravagant foods, they could project an image of compassion and piety qualities that were crucial in maintaining support from their subjects. In this way, even the most absurd food laws had deep political motivations. They weren't merely about controlling what went into the royal mouth, they were about controlling how the monarchy was seen and perceived. Equally significant was the role of food laws in maintaining the delicate balance of power among the noble classes. The seating arrangements at royal feasts were perhaps the most important aspect of any banquet. Who sat next to whom, who was seated at the head of the table, and who was relegated to the lower ranks. These seemingly insignificant details were anything but trivial. They were about loyalty, trust, and status. A nobleman's position at the table could determine his influence in the court, and even a minor breach in seating etiquette could lead to a diplomatic crisis. One law, which was introduced after an incident where a nobleman's perceived slight to a higher-ranking guest caused a public rift, decreed that seating arrangements could only be decided by the monarch himself or by the appointed royal steward. This was an effort to quell any internal power struggles within the court. No longer could nobility take their places by invitation or tradition. Now, the monarch alone held the power to dictate where each individual sat, and by extension, who was in favor and who was not. But royal dining was not just about what was eaten, how it was eaten, or where one Saturday. It was also about the performance of loyalty, submission, and dominance. A rule that governed how food was passed at royal banquets stipulated that food must always be presented to the monarch first before being served to others. This seemingly mundane law was a reflection of the absolute power of the king. It was a performance, a ritual that reinforced the idea that the monarch was the ultimate source of nourishment and authority. Every course, every dish, was a reminder of who controlled the kingdom and who relied on the monarch for survival. Over time, these seemingly trivial laws became deeply ingrained in the royal courts of Europe. They influenced not only the way monarchs ruled, but also the way courts operated. As the centuries passed, the idea that dining was a performance, a demonstration of power, remained a fixture in royal life. Whether it was through laws that dictated the preparation of food, the seating arrangements, or even the symbolism behind what was served, every royal banquet was an opportunity to stage an elaborate performance. It wasn't enough to simply eat. Every meal had to serve a greater purpose to reinforce the monarchy's image, to demonstrate loyalty, and to remind the court that everything, even food, was part of a carefully constructed political theater. The legacy of these royal dining laws is still felt today. While the grand feasts and excessive displays of wealth may have faded from the royal courts, the underlying principles of control, symbolism, and performance continue to shape the way we view power. Royal dinners may no longer be a theater of absolute authority, but the idea that food, status, and politics are intertwined remains deeply embedded in modern culture. As you close your eyes and drift off to sleep, remember this: the dining table, throughout history, has always been much more than a place to eat. It was a stage, a performance, where every bite carried weight and every gesture had meaning. It was the battlefield of power, diplomacy, and survival, a world where even the most absurd laws could change the course of history, and where the smallest detail could tip the balance of power. So, the next time you sit down to eat, consider the history that led to every meal. Bon appétit. Reflecting on the bizarre and often absurd royal dining laws of the medieval era, one cannot help but marvel at the way these strange regulations reflect the chaotic nature of the time. In an age where superstition, power struggles, and an almost theatrical performance of authority were ever present, laws were born not only out of necessity, but also as a reaction to the oddest of incidents. The medieval world, as we've seen, was filled with events so strange they seemed to defy logic. Yet these very events helped shape the legal landscape for centuries. Laws enacted because of a pig standing trial, a goose causing chaos in a joust, or a knight's drunkenness leading to a tragedy. All of these absurdities were wrapped up in a larger performance of power and control, reminding the people who was truly in charge. Take, for instance, the laws governing food and dining at royal courts. The very act of eating was not a private affair in medieval society. It was an event, a performance, one where everything from the seating arrangement to the course of the meal conveyed meaning. These laws were not just about what was consumed, but about who was allowed to eat it and under what circumstances. Whether it was forbidding certain foods to maintain an image of purity, restricting who could dine at the royal table, or enforcing strict dining etiquette, these laws were a direct extension of the monarch's power. By controlling how people ate, monarchs could shape their image, assert their dominance, and constantly remind their subjects of their unassailable position in society. What's truly fascinating is that many of these laws had far-reaching implications, not just in terms of the immediate consequences for those involved, but in the broader shaping of society. The creation of laws banning the dressing of animals for tournaments or prohibiting the consumption of certain foods spoke to deeper issues of control, hierarchy, and the preservation of royal authority. These were not arbitrary decisions, but calculated moves designed to maintain order, ensure loyalty, and reinforce the social fabric that bound monarchs to their courts, their subjects, and the very image of divine right. In many ways, medieval law was not merely about maintaining order, it was about performance. Every law enacted, no matter how bizarre, was a way to solidify power, to remind everyone of their place within the system. The absurdity of these laws might make us chuckle today, but in their time, they were powerful tools of control. From the knight who was forbidden to joust under the influence of alcohol to the baker fined for baking a crown-shaped loaf of bread, these strange rules reinforced the idea that everything in medieval society was controlled by the monarch, from the grandest of political decisions to the most seemingly trivial acts. As we close this chapter on the strange and fascinating world of medieval dining laws, it's clear that history, though often bizarre, can provide us with valuable insights into the nature of power, control, and society. The absurd events that led to these laws remind us that in the medieval world, even the most ordinary things like eating a meal or attending a tournament were connected to the larger performance of monarchy. And through these events, we see how monarchies used law not just to maintain order, but to assert and reinforce their power, even in the most unexpected ways. If you enjoyed this dive into medieval history, don't forget to subscribe for more strange and fascinating stories from the past. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What's the most bizarre historical law you've come across? Share your favorite quirky legal oddities in the comments below. And with that, sleep well, knowing that the weird and wonderful corners of history are always waiting to be explored further. Good night.